Right, okay, we are starting back with Peter. So we were dealing with the call of Peter last week, and just getting used to my there we go. And we worked a lot on the call and how sort of many times Peter was called. And if you missed the Bible study, you should be able to get it online. So, but today we're looking at Peter's denial. And I think this will be the final study in Peter. And then we'll be moving on to the likes of Andrew and Nathaniel and Philip and other men. Now they'll some of those guys will only take one study, and some of them we can pack into just a single study. But Peter tends to be one of these men where there's a lot, about him. Okay, so so we're going to be looking at chapters 6, 13, and 21 today in John, but we're also going to be looking at a whole lot of verses in the rest of the Gospels too. So there's a lot of scripture. The reason I'm doing that is because with the likes of Peter's denial, that's mentioned in all 4 of the Gospels. And it's interesting when you look at those different stories, there is differing detail, but you have to remember that the Gospels are looking at things from different points of view and different angles. So what it says to me is that there's a lot of conversation, going on, and the various writers of those Gospels is picking up different things. Okay, so right, so we're looking at, first of all, Peter's confession in chapter 6 here. So in John chapter 6, verse 60 through 69, it says, therefore many of his disciples, when they heard this, and this was the teaching where Jesus says, unless you eat my flesh and drink my blood, you have no life within you. And so a lot of the disciples had difficulty with this. Okay, so therefore many of his disciples, when they heard this, said, this is a hard saying, who can understand it? And when Jesus knew in himself that his disciples complained about this, he said to them, does this offend you? What then, if you should see the Son of Man ascend where he was before? It is the Spirit who gives life, the flesh profits nothing. The words that I speak to you are spirit and they are life. But there are some of you who do not believe. For Jesus knew from the beginning who they were who did not believe and who would betray him. And he said, therefore, I have said to you that no one can come to me unless it has been granted to him by my Father. And from that time, many of his disciples went back and walked with him no more. Then Jesus said to the 12, do you want to go away? Do you also want to go away? But Simon Peter answered him, Lord, to whom shall we go? You have the words of eternal life. Also, we have come to believe and know that you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. So now, what I want to sort of pluck out of this is because sometimes there's a bit of confusion as to, well, who's the disciples? And aren't the 12 disciples the 12 disciples? And who's being talked about here? Why is it saying, and from that time many of his disciples went back and walked with him no more? So, but then it says, and then Jesus says to the 12. Okay, so there's the 12 disciples / apostles. Okay, so what I want to do is explain what the difference is between a disciple and an apostle. Okay, so because there was loads of disciples, so all of us are disciples of Jesus, but we're not apostles. Okay, there was 12 apostles, and there are no apostles as such in this day and age, because none of us, nobody that's alive on the earth right now, has ever witnessed Jesus Christ's physical life from when he was baptized up to through the death, resurrection, and his ascension. So There's none of us here that have actually physically seen that. So there were 12 men that were picked by Christ that would experience that. So, but Peter, Jesus says to the 12, do you want to go away as well? You know, is this really causing you a lot of grief? And so this is where Peter then steps up to the mark and he says, you know, Lord, to whom shall we go? You have the words of eternal life. And also we've come to believe and know that you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. You know, bang, you know, that's a very, you know, strong statement there. Yes.
Yeah, sorry, what is that?
Yeah.
The 12 disciples, see the Great Commission, did that apply to the disciples or the apostles of the disciples?
It would have been more broadly addressed to greater disciples. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay, so disciple versus apostle. Okay, so I want to give you a bit of a breakdown as to what's what. So very simply, a disciple is a follower or a learner. Okay, because in the New Testament, it talked about the disciples of John, it talked about the disciples of the Pharisees, and also talks about the disciples of Jesus. So, you know, these were people that just followed a person or a cause. Okay. So it's one who accepts, believes, and obeys the one they are following. So that's what a disciple in a very general sense is. Now, an apostle, on the other hand, strictly speaking, in terms of what the word means, because the word apostle was not an unknown term back then. If somebody at that day and age said, "I'm an apostle," people would have understood that was one sent with a special message or a commission. Okay, so it you know, it wasn't just reserved as a term for the 12. Okay, even though that was, you know, applied to them. There was, you know, loads of apostles that came from government authorities. They were sent on a special mission, sent on a with something to do and something to say. Well, they were apostles. Okay, but you know, when we hear the word apostle in this day and age, we think of the 12. Okay, so now the original qualification of an apostle, okay, in terms of within the church, as stated by Peter in Acts 20, 21, 22, was that he should have been personally acquainted with our Lord's ministry from his baptism by John to his ascension. So so if you look at those particular verses, that is what is the criteria. So now, in a broad sense, I think you have apostles today, not in this sense, but in a broader sense, God does select people for a special task. And so those people could be labeled as missionaries. Okay, so people that have been sent out, commissioned by a church, a commending assembly, to go and do a certain thing. So in a broad sense, they could be considered apostles, but that sounds a bit loaded.
Pastor.
Well, yes, you know, a pastor could, you know, be apostolic in that broad sense, but the problem is that a lot of churches would view apostolic authority as going, oh, well, you know, I'm really way up there. You know, I'm at the top of the food chain. So so it is a bit of a somewhat loaded and misunderstood sort of thing. But so I just wanted to, you know, put those two definitions out there so that you understand you know, what's happening. So Jesus had loads of disciples because he did send 70 out 2 by 2, you know, one of the stories there. But the 12 disciples had specific authority given to them by Christ, and so they were apostles. So now later on, you had people like Paul, who was labeled as an apostle, but he did witness the resurrected Christ. Okay, he was a contemporary of Jesus in those days, so he would have been very aware, even though he wasn't brought into the group, as it were, sort of much later on, yet he was a witness to these things. And then Matthias, who was the replacement of Judas Iscariot, he was a witness. He was around. So, but strangely enough, you don't hear anything about Matthias after he's brought into the 12. It's like that's the end of that. So, but anyway, all these men, had a special message and a special commission from the Lord Himself.
You could be an apostle with it.
Well, maybe in a very broad sense.
You don't have to call you Apostle Woody.
No, you don't. No, I would prefer you not to call me Apostle Woody, because that's that again it carries a lot of kind of loaded and presumptuous sort of information. So just call me Woody.
Woody the Apostle. Apostle Woody. Woody the Apostle.
Woody the Apostle.
Yes. It's like, stop. So I remember the first Bible study that we had. There was a girl that came and she called it WWW, and it was the word with Woody.
Yeah.
So anytime you saw a website address, it's like, www, it's like, oh yeah.
That's for www.
Yeah. Dear. Okay, right. So Jesus foretells Peter's denial. Okay, so here's Peter putting his best foot forward and saying, where else shall we go? You're the one that has eternal life. We've come to know that you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. So, you'd think after this great statement, Peter would be on solid ground. Right. Okay, now let's look at Matthew 26, verse 30 through 35. And when they had sung a hymn, they went out to the Mount of Olives. This was right after the Last Supper. And then Jesus said to them, all of you will be made to stumble because of me this night, for it is written, I will strike the shepherd, and the sheep of the flock will be scattered. But after I have been raised, I will go before you to Galilee. And Peter answered and said to him, even if all were made to stumble because of you, I will never be made to stumble. And Jesus said to him, assuredly, I say to you that this night, before the rooster crows, you will deny me 3 times. And Peter said to him, even if I were to die with you, I will not deny you. So, so anyway, we see, and so said all the other disciples. So it wasn't just Peter. Everybody said this. It was like, no, we're not gonna leave you. We won't deny you. No, we're in there. We're thick or thin. Boom. So
Then we would say the same.
we would say the same thing. But when push comes to shove and Hardy comes to Hardy, I find it interesting. A lot of new Christians would say, "Oh, I wouldn't be like them and deny and do all that." I would be in there. Yeah. Okay. Well, let's look at the reality of these things, and then the wonderful thing is seeing how then Jesus deals with this. Because Jesus, could have, at the denial of everybody, saying, "See you boys? Oh, okay, you're gone." So down the road. Okay. Now, let's look at Mark here. And when they had sung a hymn, we went out to the Mount of Olives. And then Jesus said to him, all of you will be made to stumble because of me this night, for it is written, I will strike the shepherd, and the sheep will be scattered. But after I have been raised, I will go before you to Galilee. Peter said to them, even if all were made to stumble, yet I will not be. And Jesus said to him, assuredly, I say to you that today, even this night, before the rooster crows twice, you will deny me 3 times. But he spoke more vehemently, if I have to die with you, I will not deny you. And they all said like this. So this is very similar to Matthew. The only difference is that Jesus is quoted about saying about the rooster crowing twice. Okay, which then feeds into when we actually see this later on in Mark. So Luke chapter 22.
Excuse me, when
Yes.
what does it say the rooster will crow twice and your other man said 3 times?
No, what Jesus says, we'll go back to that. Jesus says before you, he says, surely I say to you today, this night, before the rooster crows twice, you will deny me 3 times. So Jesus said about the rooster crowing prior to that.
But did the
once.
rooster crow 3 times or twice?
Well, twice according to Mark.
I
But
thought it crowed 3 times.
No.
no,
No,
so
twice.
Twice in Mark. It's only labeled as once in the rest of the Gospels.
Yeah.
Right.
So now, the reason there's this difference is because how they talked about these things is they would talk about, when the rooster actually finished crowing, that was when it crowed.
Mhm.
Okay, so, they didn't say, it could have crowed, half a dozen times,
Yeah.
but basically, like some Matthew, Luke, and John would say, well, after all that's done, that's when the rooster crowed.
Right,
Okay, so, but Mark is talking about when it crowed twice.
right.
So, so some people get messed up about this because they go, well, no, so there's inconsistency there. That's, the Bible can't be relied upon because it's saying about twice
Yeah,
and the others, so I understand that, but this is why we stand here and explain it, So, again, it's, writing to different audiences and, dealing with different people with different sorts of understandings of culture and so on. Okay, so Luke 22 says, and the Lord said, this is, a very different angle on the story, where Jesus says to Peter, Simon, Simon, indeed Satan has asked for you that he may sift you as wheat, but I have prayed for you that your faith should not fail, and when you return to me, strengthen your brethren. And he said to him, Lord, I'm ready to go with you both to prison and to death. And then he said, I tell you, Peter, the rooster shall not crow this day before you will deny 3 times that you know me. So that's a rather short description there of what Jesus was saying, but he's really focusing on Peter here, whereas in Matthew and Mark, he's basically saying, you will all be made to stumble because of me, and then after I'm raised, and but Luke here is focusing in on Peter and making some very interesting statements about what Satan does. Luke is very interested in spiritual goings on, and so here there's this discussion about Satan asking for you, and in the New American, the New American Standard Bible, it puts it this way. It says Satan has demanded permission to sift you as wheat. And I think that's very interesting and very telling, because Satan cannot do anything to you outside of God's will. It has to go through the filter of God. So, and that is, I think, a great comfort, because God's designs and God's purposes are always greater and bigger than the enemy's.
That reminds you of Job there, doesn't it?
Yeah. So, see, Job knew nothing about what was going on in heaven. But what Satan is demanding permission about is that he may sift you as wheat. Now, that idea is to, the sifting of wheat was to, take wheat, and either thresh it, and throw it and separate it. But I think here is more talking about taking the grain and crushing it down into flour. And it's like being put through the mill. Okay, we would use that sort of language, So Satan is demanding permission to put you through the mill.
Was that really then because Peter got so close to God? Was that then, or it was a prideful then? Was it his pride sort of thinking, well, I've been with God and I don't leave him?
Mm.
And, you know, well, he wasn't sort of saying, you know,
Mm.
he never thought of himself as a particular human, but,
Yeah.
you know, just I'm with you the whole time, and then, you know, the Lord sort of saying, well, he kind of, he knows
Yeah.
he's not. He's not.
Yeah. I mean, Jesus knows what he's going to do,
Yeah.
and he knows his motivation behind it.
Yeah.
But you know, even though Satan has desired to do this, and that he's going to sift him as wheat, and really he has been given permission to actually do that. But Jesus says, "I've prayed for you that your faith should not fail." Isn't it wonderful to think that the Lord Jesus Christ prays for us? He holds us up, even through hard, difficult things.
Failure.
Yeah, and and then Jesus says, "When you have returned to me, strengthen your brethren." Now, this is where Peter kicks off and says, "You know, Lord, I'm ready to go with you both to prison and to death. What are you talking about? Me return to you? I ain't going anywhere." So, and yet Jesus knows what's going to happen, and the lessons that Peter is then going to learn as a result. And then he, says to him, "Peter, I tell you that, about the Christian denial and so on."
And one of the main things is, that your faith.
Yeah, but faith won't fail, and that's really, really important, because that is the only thing that pleases God. For without faith, it's impossible to please him. For he who comes to God must believe that he is, and that he's a rewarder of those who diligently seek him. Okay, now let's look at John here, John 13. So Simon Peter said to him, "Lord, where are you going?" And Jesus answered him, "Where I am going, you cannot follow me now, but you shall follow me afterward." Peter said to him, "Lord, why can't I follow you now? I will lay down my life for your sake." And then Jesus answered, "Will you lay down your life for my sake? Most assuredly, I say to you, the rooster shall not crow until you've denied me 3 times. So, and this all happens, in this transition between the upper room and going to the garden. Okay, so I would imagine, that, even though there's a lot of different angles on this story, it could be, an ongoing conversation, where Peter's going, but Jesus, now, wait a minute, no, this isn't right, what you're saying. I'm ready to go with you both to prison, and Jesus is then repeating, and saying, "Look, Peter, look, listen to me. You're going to deny me before the rooster crows 3 times." So, so there's no disparaging really, in the narrative. Some people would look at this and say, no, that's completely different. But you have to understand that, again, there's John the Apostle, there's Matthew. Okay, so those are 2 people that are the apostles who wrote 2 gospels. Then you have Mark, who is Mark's gospel is more Peter's rendition of things. So, and then Luke is really a conglomeration of a lot of research, basically, from people that were there and so on, putting pieces together. So, so you would have had, say, 3 different apostles, then looking at this from 3 different angles and remembering 3 kinds of different things, So,
But it's still all consistent,
Oh, yeah.
One thing is, you're gonna deny me 3 times.
exactly, yeah.
It was done,
Yeah.
so it's all.
So that's undeniable. Yeah. Okay, now, what's Peter's denial then look like in Matthew? Okay, so Matthew 26. Now Peter sat outside of the courtyard, outside in the courtyard. This was the courtyard of the high priest's house. Okay, and a servant girl came to him saying, "You also were with Jesus of Galilee." So there's a lot of people, Jesus was arrested probably in and around midnight. Okay, so it's dark. All right, the only thing you can see is people's torches, not flashlights, but flaming things. And so a lot of hustle and bustle, and and then taking them into the courtyard. Now we know from Luke, when we read this, Jesus was there. He was sitting in the courtyard too, waiting on things. And so Peter is in this courtyard. He is also there with John. We know that from the Gospel of John. But again, it's all the focus on Peter here and what's happening with him. So there's all these people.
Was Thomas there? Was Thomas the one that actually went in to talk to him?
No, that would have been John.
Was that John?
No, it was John,
There was
yeah.
someone-
Yeah. Yeah, there was someone who knew the high priest, knew the crack there. So that people would generally say that was John.
Oh, okay.
Okay. So even though it doesn't say it was John, but that's how John sort of portrayed himself in this kind of, my name's not important kind of. So we have this first girl saying, you also were with Jesus of Galilee. And so, but he denied it before them all, saying, I do not know what you are saying. Okay.
Well, I really, was it like a pride thing? Or, like, what would have loved to be saying? Or was it fear?
I think it's more fear.
Yeah.
I don't know if it's pride in that sense. I think it's just more, caught in the hop
Yeah.
and caught in the back foot. I think now it does say in Matthew just prior to this that Peter went into the courtyard to see the end.
Yeah.
And I find that such drilling language. It's like Jesus is going to see the end. It's like Peter has spent 3 years with Jesus, and now he's going to go and see the end.
See the end of what, women?
That Jesus is going to be condemned and put to death.
Oh, right.
So it's saying that Peter still didn't believe, really. He said, where would he go?
Yeah.
He was Jesus, or Jesus was the Son of God, but he still didn't believe in his heart of the resurrection and, everything really.
Well, yes, he didn't understand those things, even though Jesus had talked about those things. They were confused about it, because really all of those apostles, their understanding, along with everybody else's understanding back then, was that Jesus was going to come and set up an earthly kingdom. Now, when your earthly king is come, he's condemned, and he's put to death, that's a problem with your thinking.
Yeah.
That's an existential problem. Okay.
That's in verse 58.
Yeah.
Matthew 58.
But you don't mean to the end, that you don't mean the crucifixion.
No, well, that would be the eventual outcome, but in
The end of what he denied.
well, the end, well, what was when Peter was going in to see the end, so that was before this, okay, before he denied, he was going into the courtyard to see, basically, this is it.
Oh, right.
This is the end of my road.
Right.
Jesus is going to be tried. He's going to be, fired on a cross and all this stuff. And I've just spent 3 years and this is it.
Right.
He
still hadn't understood.
No, and yeah, and some of us have been there. We've been at the end of our travel with something, and we just go, is that it? And you see no hope, you see no way forward, and you feel like, well, maybe I'll just go and down to the bar and get stuff, so, but anyway, so we've had one denial here so far, and then when he gone out to the gateway, another girl saw him and said to those who were there, this fellow also was with Jesus of Nazareth. So there's one girl that approaches him, and then there's this other person, and says, along with a lot of other people, hey, your man, him, look, he was there. And so, so there's a little bit of a crowd sort of gathering around. And so this puts a little bit of pressure on Peter, so, and then what he says, and again, he denied with an oath, I don't know the man. And then a little later, those who stood by came up and said to Peter, surely you are one of them, for your speech betrays you. So he had a Galilean accent compared to people that had a Jerusalem accent. So it's like, you're not from around here, bud. You have no business being down here. You're from up north. You know, so we know who you are. We know where you're from. And now again, John, when we look at it, puts in a few bit more detail in terms of who this particular accuser is, and so on. You know, so and then he began to curse and swear, saying, "I don't know the man." So,
For sure, man.
but can you imagine that Peter here is cursing and swearing?
He needs to do whatever he can.
Yes, and he's getting boxed in, he's getting painted into a corner here, and he doesn't like it. So he is then going to use language that is really not befitting of somebody who follows Christ. I mean, he is effing and blinding. That's sad commentary there. That's, you know, but the Bible doesn't hold back in terms of detail here. So and immediately a rooster crowed, and Peter remembered the word of Jesus, who had said to him, before the rooster crows, you would deny me 3 times. And so he went out and wept bitterly. Okay, so
that really has hurt.
yeah, yes, and it in the I think it's the film Jesus of Nazareth with Robert Powell and all that, you know, the old 1970s film. I remember that particular scene, you know, where Peter denies the Lord and then, you know, goes out and weeps bitterly. Now, because of cinematography, you know, they're only spending 5 or 10 seconds on that particular scene where, you know, Peter's out in an entry somewhere and going boo-hooing. Now, if you go out and you weep bitterly, that's you for hours, if not days. He is ripped apart, just completely toast, you know. So now in Mark here, 14 says, now as Peter was below in the courtyard, one of the servant girls of the high priest came, and when she saw Peter warming himself, she looked at him and said, you also were with Jesus of Nazareth. Can you imagine this? You know, here they're standing by a fire, you know, and that's what they had to do back then, to warm themselves, you know, because it was, you know, it's arid, it's desert, you know, and when it's nighttime, it's cold. You know, when my daughter Helene was down in Namibia, it was freezing at night. During the day, it was 40 degrees for sure. So, you know, Peter's standing there, all these people, and then your girl comes up and looks at him, you know, just drills straight into his face. You're one of them.
And he just wants to jail him the rest of them, doesn't he?
Well,
He just
but,
wants to.
you know, it's hard to know, you know, it's hard to, you know, how could, you know, what's Peter doing there anyway? But the Bible does say he's there to see the end.
Yeah.
Yeah, this is the same Peter who drew the sword out and prepared to fight
Yeah, sure.
at the arrest.
Yeah. So, but he denied it, saying, I neither know nor understand what you are saying. And so he went out on the porch, and the rooster crowed. Now this is Mark. Okay, so this is the first time the rooster crows. And then another servant girl saw him again. So this is consistent, and began to say to those who stood by, remember she's gathering them in the crowd, and says that this is one of them, but he denied it. And a little later, those who stood by said to Peter again, you know, surely you are one of them, for you are a Galilean, and your speech shows it.
I never saw them having different accents.
Yeah.
Ballerina accent, ballerina accent.
Yeah, but never would have thought that they would have given that as a different accents.
Yeah, I would say that it would be a bit like people in Dublin compared to people in Northern Ireland. Okay, so, you know, there is a big difference. Now, see, when I first came to Ireland, which was in Dublin, I was geared up for the Southern accent. See, when I met Elaine, I couldn't understand her for 2 weeks. Yeah, and now there was a lot of Belfast in there too, you know, and so, yeah, Belfast. So, yeah, but you know, it is kind of funny, you know, but you know, we know people from the North Coast, we know people from Ballymena, we know people from Enniskillen and, you know, and Armagh, you know, so, you know, we can pick up these various sorts of
So it's like
twang's,
somebody
you know.
coming from Dublin into Ballymena, trying to fit in with these from Ballymena and then saying,
Yeah,
no.
Yeah.
You're not.
no, you're not from
Your
around here,
accent
yeah.
doesn't- Yeah.
So, but you know, even people that lived in Nazareth, okay, the people in Nazareth, the people surrounding Nazareth thought Nazarenes sounded really stupid. You know, they thought their accent was really crude, you know, and really bullshit or something. It was, you know, see them, they're uncultured people. Like people. So, what you know, all that stuff. And then he began to curse and swear. And so here's our cursing and swearing. I do not know this man of whom you speak. The second time the rooster crowed, and then Peter called to mind the word that Jesus had said to him before the rooster crows twice, he will deny me 3 times. And then when he thought about it, he wept. You know, so it's very interesting language here. So now Luke 22. Now this is scary stuff here. Having arrested him, they led him and brought him into the high priest's house, but Peter followed at a distance. Now, when they kindled a fire in the midst of the courtyard and sat down together, Peter sat among them, and a certain servant girl, seeing him as he sat by the fire, looked intently at him and said, "This man was also with him." You know, here Luke uses very vivid language. You know, looked intently at him. You know, it wasn't like, "Oh yeah, I see you." You know, no, you know, went up to him in his face. You know, just, you know. So, but he denied him. It's interesting. This is where it's very clear. He denies him. He denies Jesus. So it doesn't say he denied it. He denied him. Saying, "Woman, I don't know him." And after a little while, another saw him and said, "You also are one of them." But Peter said, "Man, I am not." And after about an hour had passed, so here we know what the time scale is. So we're talking probably between, say, 2 and 3 in the morning. So another confidently affirmed. It's very interesting language too. You know, he's, you know, very sure. "Surely this fellow also was with him, for he is a Galilean." But Peter said, "Man, I do not know what you are saying." You know, it's almost like, you know, I don't speak English. Speaking Espanol or something like that, or Parle-vous Français, or so, he's like, "No, I don't even know what you're after." But, you know, because you're accusing me of being a Galilean, so I don't even understand what you Jerusalem people are saying. So. And immediately while he was still speaking, the rooster crowed, and the Lord turned and looked at Peter.
That's why he ran shivers up your spine.
And then Peter remembered the word of the Lord, who had said to him, "Before the rooster crows, you will deny me 3 times." So Peter went out and wept bitterly.
You can understand why he went bitterly when the Lord looks, you know.
So we'll talk about that in a couple of minutes here as to what that look was like. Now, here's John. Simon Peter followed Jesus, and so did another disciple. That is probably John. Now that disciple was known to the high priest and went with Jesus into the courtyard of the high priest, but Peter stood at the door outside, and the other disciple who was known to the high priest went out and spoke to her, who kept the door, and brought Peter in. You know, it's almost like, well, because there's a bit of an association there, it's like, well, duh. And then the servant girl who kept the door said to Peter, "You are not also one of these man's disciples, are you?" And he said, "I am not." And now the servants and the officers who had made a fire of coals stood there, for it was cold, and they warmed themselves, and Peter stood with them and warmed himself. Now, if you take this into consideration from Luke, Jesus is there. Peter's warming himself around this fire and looking over every so often, and he sees Jesus sitting there.
Just to stop denying, and he's denying to his face.
Yeah,
But the servant girl in that one is jumping in the shops.
yes,
Saying, yes, I do know Jesus,
yeah,
but he didn't, or
Yeah.
other ones said, are you
Yeah,
with Jesus, yeah? So that's kind of,
yeah, it's interesting. So now Simon Peter stood and warmed himself, and therefore they said to him, you are not also one of his disciples, are you? Okay, so this sort of feedback what you're saying, giving him an opportunity now. And he denied it and said, I am not. And one of the servants of the high priest, a relative of him whose ear Peter cut off, in the Garden of Gethsemane. So, you know, here's Peter who drew out the sword, and boom, you know, on their man's right here. And even Jesus healed that man. Did I not see you in the garden with him? And Peter then denied it again, and immediately a rooster crowed. So that's all four stories here, you know, and so I think when you look at them all together, you can see the consistency of them, but you can also see some different detail that's there.
I never realized that he actually denied him in front of Jesus.
Yeah.
I thought he denied him, you know, when Jesus wasn't there.
No. So, and that's, you know, to me, that's scary monsters, you know, so, now, what can we learn so far from all this? There's been an awful lot of scripture. Okay. Peter speaks from the heart, not the mind. Okay. He is reactionary, not responsive. It is understandable and sincere, but it's not right. You know, in terms of, you know, he's impulsive, he's impetuous. You know, Jesus, no, I'll not deny you. You know, I won't go down this road. I won't stumble. But you know, now that's understandable and it is sincere, but it's reactionary. So, now Peter did not inquire as to what the Lord meant. He made an assumption about the Lord's mission fitting within Peter's framework. Okay, so this is the two things that Jesus or is the problem here, is about earthly revolution versus heavenly transformation. Okay, because what Peter and everybody else wants is earthly revolution. They're like, we need this Messiah to come and deal with the Romans, because there's an occupying force in our land. That's not good. We can't have our kingdom properly. So Jesus is our ticket to ride to do that. So, but Jesus did not come to establish politics on the earth. He came to deal with people's hearts. So that's why I say here, earthly but revolution versus heavenly transformation. So, yeah, and you know,
Even after the resurrection, one of the apostles asked him, Lord, will you restore the kingdom now?
yeah,
So they still haven't got
yeah,
it.
no, they still thought there was going to be, you know. So, but you know, it's interesting. You know, Peter doesn't ask. You know, but Jesus makes this statement about everybody's going to be made to stumble and fall, and you know, all these sort of things. And instead of Peter saying, "Well, Lord, what do you mean? What do you mean by that?" Okay, so 6 words. You know, that's a very important statement or question to ask anybody. Is what do you mean?
He really lacked maturity, didn't he? Like, really, Peter.
Yeah, he was an insecure man, and so when we know a lot of them, you know, and we might be one of them, you know. Okay, now Peter's earthly perspective resulted in a fleshly reaction of denial. So because, you know, his view was that this is going to be an earthly kingdom being established here, and Jesus isn't feeding into this narrative. So it's like, and because it's then based on that, he doesn't see any way out of it other than, well, I'll just deny it. because it's not gonna work, you know, because he went there to see the end.
Well, obviously, he was protecting himself too. He didn't-
Well, sure, you know, and don't we do this? Yeah, so I mean, we can all sit with Peter and go, "Okay, Peter, I understand where you're at. You know, we can't sit in judgment of Peter. So,
But
but-
look at the benefits that we get out of this,
yeah,
you know, for us.
sure, absolutely. So denial is regressive. I did use the word previously when I was typing this up, progressive, but progressive means that you're moving forward. Regression is going backwards. Okay, so he says, I don't know him. I am not. I don't know what you're saying. Now, basically what he's doing here is denial says he lacks knowledge of Jesus, meaning I don't know him, lacks identity with Jesus, I'm not. And lacks the language and understanding that Jesus taught. I don't even know what you're saying.
It's basically the amount of fields.
Mhm.
You see the way that you said there, Woody, about, you know, we could all be in Peter's, see where Peter's coming from. But that's the lowest of the low.
Yeah, it is.
I wouldn't like to think that I would do it. Or,
Well,
Siobhan,
no, but,
think for each second.
yeah.
We're in North Korea. And that door suddenly opens and half a dozen soldiers with Kalashnikovs come in. And they surround us. And one guy goes there and says, we're gonna shoot you in 1 minute's time. But I'll give you a chance. If any of you are not a real Christian, you can walk out that door now. And my question to myself is many times, but I get to
But the way I would think about that, Sam, would be, if you walked out that door, your life wouldn't be worth living. Could you deny it?
But in the heat of the moment,
Yeah.
and you're sitting at that Kalashnikov, and you're thinking of your children and your family,
Save my life.
I could see my thoughts would be, I'm denied now, but I'll deny to them, but not really.
you know, and I've heard stories too about that kind of thing happening where people where Christians who were faced with that kind of option did deny and then walked out, and then they went after them and shot them because they weren't man enough to actually stand up.
Like somebody come in here and said, right, are you a Christian or are you not a Christian, right? If you said, no, I'm not a Christian. Life would your life not be like, if you died
Well, you know,
alone,
and that's a good perspective to have. You know, that's a
you'd rather be shot and go to heaven
well,
than live
that's
for the
fine.
rest of your life with the Lord.
But I think, you know, you know, what this whole thing is demonstrating really is when push comes to shove, you know, Peter, you know, bailed out. You know, he lost the plot. Now, we can look then at why. And then we can learn from that and say, well, if it ever comes to across our door, then we know what to do.
Yeah.
So,
Well, my opinion would be, you know, like the Bible talks about keeping your lamp on the lampstand.
yeah,
And every day we've got an opportunity to, and I'm not saying I'm far from perfect here.
Yeah.
But we've got an opportunity to do something for God, or to God has something for us to do.
Yeah.
And might involve a witness or something like that, but if we deny that,
Yeah.
and I've done it many times.
Yeah.
Yes,
I think I was still as Peter in them, and that would be my opinion.
But to be say, I don't know him, I don't know nothing about him.
Well, I think that's the same sort of point, and I think, you know, we're all being verbal about it.
Yeah, I know what you mean, I know what you mean.
so, but you know, this last little bit about denial, you know, it's interesting what Peter's, you know, statements sort of represent. You know, it's like, you know, I don't know anything about Jesus. I don't identify with him, and I don't use the language that I've been taught. You know, what it does is it helps me to say, okay, do I know him? Am I truly identified with him? Do I use the language that Jesus uses? You know, because Peter effed and blind. He cursed and swore and all that kind of stuff. You know, that's not really terribly Christian, you know. So I sit with people that do a lot of that kind of stuff, and even Christian people, you know, they're frustrated and they just say, you know, see that effing, you know, and you know, so at times, you know, you want to recoil and say, look, but stop it. No, we're not going there. We're not talking like that. but sometimes you have to go and sit with people and go, they're frustrated, they're angry, and you have to take it and walk with them to a place where it's better. You know, so, and that's hard to do, because it would be a lot easier for me just to say, but see, all your 4-letter words, go and stick it where the sun don't shine. And, I'm away until you sort of, so. No, yeah, so, and then this is where the Spirit of God has to work with them in conviction and so on. Right. So, it was done right in front of the Lord himself, as we were saying there earlier. The look of the Lord, okay. The Lord turned and looked at Peter. So this look of the Lord, I believe, was a mixture of conviction and love. Peter did wrong, but the Lord continued to love and will restore, because that's what Jesus says. He says that Simon, Satan has demanded permission to sift you as wheat, but I've prayed for you that your faith may not fail, and when you return, strengthen your brethren. So Jesus had the whole thing mapped out, and so I don't think Jesus was looking at Peter going, oh, here we go, dead on. He wasn't rolling his eyes, he wasn't blowing and tutting. He was looking at him and with this very strange mixture of things. I mean, could you imagine the scene if it was in a movie? Here's Jesus, sitting over here, and Peter's by the fire, and these people are all coming, and then he denies him the 3rd time, and then he looks over, and Jesus looks at him, and it's like everybody else melts away. You and you and the Lord are the only ones on the scene. And you're looking at Jesus, and Jesus is looking at you, and there's this conveyance of, you've done wrong. You need to understand that, but I love you. This is why the man went out and broke down. Was because I can't reconcile this. Why would Jesus tell me I'm wrong, but then tell me that he loves me at the same time? So I don't think Jesus smiled at him, but there's something that he conveys, that only God can do. Sometimes when we look at people and we know them, we know what they're thinking, we know what they're saying, or whatever. So, but Peter couldn't reconcile the two things, so hence he broke down. So. And even after the resurrection, Peter likely feels that he's going on the bridge too far, and would never be able to get back to where he was with Jesus. So he goes back to fishing, what he knew from the past.
How many people today think the same thing?
Yep. So I deal with people like that all the time. People that have professed faith, botched up, and they go, there we go. That's me, Salsa. That's me, Goose. So. Now, with Jesus, there is never anything to go back to. It is going forward in him. So, because Jesus never wants us to go back to anything. This is why I don't generally like the idea of talking about addiction ministry as a recovery program, because you have nothing to recover. It's about going forward. It's about restoration. Okay. So now our logo in Stars is Stars Recovery in Christ. Now the reason we do that is so that we can basically link in with other people that come from sort of similar backgrounds and similar experiences that are going through recovery programs, but we have something better. This is the restoration process that Jesus goes through. And it'll be online. Okay, John 21. Simon Peter went up and dragged the net to land full of large fish, 153. Although there were so many, the net was not broken. And Jesus said to him, "Come and eat breakfast." And yet none of the disciples dared ask him, "Who are you?" knowing that it was the Lord. And Jesus then came and took the bread and gave it to them, and likewise the fish. And this is now the 3rd time Jesus showed himself to the disciples after he was raised from the dead. So when they had eaten breakfast, Jesus said to Simon Peter, Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these? And he said to him, yes, Lord, you know that I love you. And he said to him, feed my lambs. And then he said to him a second time, Simon, son of Jonah, do you love me? And he said to him, yes, Lord, you know that I love you. And he said, tend my sheep. And then he said to him a third time, Simon, son of Jonah, do you love me? Peter was grieved because he had said to him the third time, do you love me? And he said to him, Lord, you know all things. You know that I love you. And Jesus said to him, feed my sheep. Now, I believe that what Jesus was doing here and asking these three questions was to deal with the three denials. But there's something that you do not see in the English here that we'll need to go and see in the Greek. Because there's just things that we miss. So this is the restoration process, as I would call it. Jesus addresses the physical situation first. Let's have breakfast. You know, that's important.
Yeah.
Because Jesus provided from his own resource, not the disciples. If you notice, when they drag the fish to the shore, Jesus has breakfast ready. So it's not their fish, it's his fish. Okay, so it's his resource. He said, look, I'm going to feed you things physically here that, you know, we're not worried about your here there. But mood is better when hunger is satisfied. So because when you're hungry, you're hangry.
Yeah.
Okay. So I think Jesus does this very deliberately because he's then going to speak to Peter about spiritual things, and you need to be physically in a good place. You see, if Jesus went and says, right, boys, come on up here, and you've been out there all night toiling and messing about, catching nothing. Now get over here and I'm going to tell you a thing or two. Yeah, you'd be like, you know. So, you know, you just get very kind of weak. You know. So there's three questions here. First one, Jesus says, do you love me? Now he's using this Greek word, agapeo. This is how Peter responds. Listen to this. You know that I love you. Uses a different Greek word, phileo. Now, let me give you the difference between the two. Agape or agapeo is a love that has a sense of veneration, completeness, profoundness, eternality. It is God-centered. It is an all-encompassing, unconditional love. But how Peter replies is this. He says it's a love that has a sense of cherishing friendship, simple personal attachment, and devoted affection. That's a step down. The city in America that's called Philadelphia is the city of brotherly love. That's what Philly is that. So it's more about kind of earthly, family, friendly affection. It's not God's love. So Jesus is saying, I've loved, you know, did you love me with a God love? And Peter can't get there.
Is that because of the spirit? Sorry.
No, I was just going to say, it's moved up the other one than I'm very steady.
I just think, yeah, no, I don't think it's denial. I think he's just realizing now he just doesn't have the capacity to deal with it. So now, Jesus then says in his reply to this, he says, then feed my lambs. Now that's the Greek word bosko. And then Jesus comes back to him and he says, do you love me? And uses this same Greek word, agape. Peter replies the same way he did with phileo. And then Jesus replies to this by saying, well, you need to tend my sheep. Now, in the King James Bible, the word feed is throughout all those. It says feed, 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 but the word is translated better here, feed, tend, and then feed. Okay, because they're two different words. Now the difference between those two, the feed and the tend here, is the first feed has to do with feeding physically, in terms of, saying feed the sheep, and it also has a spiritual dimension to it as well. But it's giving, in terms of the flock of God, physical things that they need and spiritual things that they need. So when we go to church on a Sunday morning, we're getting fed. Okay. Now, Jesus then introduces a new topic, which is tend my sheep, which means to shepherd, which means to give guidance to. Okay. So yes, you can get guidance on a Sunday morning, but it's more, one of the shepherds in the church, elders, pastor, whatever, gives guidance.
Well, is there a difference there between lambs and sheep?
Yes. The lambs would have been obviously the young sheep. Okay, so they have to be handled sort of more tenderly and differently in that sense. Whereas the sheep are more kind of mum, they kind of the older sort of experienced things. So so feed my lambs is, young ones in the church, give them the food, give them the right things that they need. And then you see your older people, give them guidance. Now,
You see, whenever Jesus says, do you love me, agape, isn't Jesus the only one that can love like that? Are we
yeah,
capable
well,
of like
yes,
that?
initially, but his goal is that we get to that. Yeah. So, God doesn't want us to stay at the kind of earthly level. Now, this is what Jesus does here with the third question. He says, do you love me? Now Jesus has stepped down a notch and gone down to Peter's level. So you don't see this in the English. You only see it in the Greek. That's interesting. Jesus starts off with the first two questions about God-centered, unconditional love. Peter, do you have this? He can't get there. And so the third time, Jesus says, right, I'll meet you at your level.
That's powerful. See, I thought it was not because Peter felt the fear, the way by Dan.
Yeah.
Jesus, he couldn't meet that, so that's why he didn't give that answer back. But yeah, you just not my questions.
So then Peter says, you know that I love you. Now he's grieved about this. Remember, it says he's grieved because Jesus had said to him the third time. Well, the reason he's grieved is because the third time he asked, he's gone down to his level.
And does Peter realize that?
Yeah. And then Jesus says, well, feed my sheep. Now, Jesus went to Peter's level and worked from there, but showed where he needed to be and what he needed to do in terms of feeding and guiding. I think this is a wonderful thing to talk about, that Jesus, despite what this man has done, says, look, I can help you with love, and I can help you with what you need to do. Because this guy was completely demoralized.
Yeah.
I was a Peter myself.
Mhm.
I see it was a boy of 9. left the primary school, went to secondary school, failed the Lord in the secondary school. And it was through God's love, He left me through the 4 years of the secondary school. And in His love and His mercy, He brought me back.
Yeah.
But He took me back to Calvary.
Yeah.
He took me back to that active love.
Yeah.
Yeah. And since I came back to the Lord at the age of leaving school, I have learned to love the Lord with that active love.
Yeah.
That He's done for me.
Because when you look at Peter's writings, he uses agape. You know, in First Peter, Second Peter, he talks about agape. He doesn't talk about phileo, love anymore. But so just to finish this off here, I was actually thinking whether we need to do this in 2 sittings, but anyway, we've covered a lot. You know? So
Or a bit more quieter.
yeah, we're a bit quick. So the Lord successfully deals with Peter. You know, I've sat with a lot of people who have gone to doctors, gone to counselors, gone to a variety of different things, and they don't get success. See, when they come to the Lord gives success. Now, there are some people that fall away from that, sort of like what your experience was. You know, you think you know better, and so you go and you do things. You know, and that's what Peter did. Peter went back to fishing. Guess what he caught? Nothing. But then Jesus says, well, if you throw your net over the right side of the boat, you'll find some.
Yeah.
You know, and I can imagine Peter and all them are all going, sounds awful lot like Luke 5 here. Jesus told us back then to go and throw our net in the deep. And I only threw one net in, for goodness sake, and then my net was near busted. And our boats were near sinking. You know, so they knew, that it was the Lord after that. So Peter finds his adequacy in the Lord. Peter loves Jesus with all his heart. Peter serves Jesus with all his heart. And finally, in Hebrews 10:14, it says, for by one offering, he has perfected forever those who are being sanctified. So Peter is in a process of being sanctified, being set apart for God's work. And yet it's by this one offering that Jesus gives when he's on the cross, he perfects you.
There's an awful lot to learn from Peter, like, because, I let the Lord down every day, and to my shame, I let the Lord down every day, but in my heart, I think, well, I haven't denied him, but as Gareth says, it's just the same. It's just the same. But God never gave up on Peter.
No, and that is what we have clearly seen.
Not give up on us either.
Yeah, and so
That didn't go on anyway.
Yeah, right.
But does it not say a verse there, whenever the Lord was raised from the dead, and he came back, and he says, go and tell my disciples,
And Peter.
and Peter,
Yes, and Mark.
is that right? And he remembered Peter, he was there for him.
Yeah.
Which is Peter's account, really.
Yeah, yes, yeah.
That gives me goosebumps.